an alternative history of the 20th century violin. Where did the sound, the new type of virtuosity of the violin of the early years of the 20th century come from? When we play the work of Stravinsky and Bartók, the pieces that emerge in the years during and after the First World War, there are questions to be answered, and there are no right answers. Perhaps we need to travel down some unfamiliar paths to find a way of understanding where this sound came from, and to maybe explore alternative routes from some of the more conventional responses given to the origin of the new virtuosity they are exploring. The answers which are usually given speak to Slav questions, and I would like to suggest there are other possibilities as to what they are exploring. I've been closely involved with a strange interweave between Danish and Norwegian traditional and art music for violin solo since my late teens. My exploration began with the discovery of the pioneering transcriptions made by Johan Halvorsen of the works played by the great Hardanger violinists, the traditional violinists, the Slotter. These transcriptions were initiated by Edvard Grieg, who asked Johan Halvorsen to go and make the transcriptions. He initially suggested he did them in about 3 decades before the end of the 19th century, but they weren't completed until the last decade and were published by Peter's Verlag in 1901. I was given the first edition of Halvorsen's astonishingly faithful transcriptions of these Slotter when I was a teenager. They've been on and off my music desk ever since. It took me a long time to get to grips with how groundbreaking these actually were, but gradually, bit by bit, these became the touchstone of my approach to the violin alone. A quote from Halvorsen about the work. "Today I saved 2 folk dances from oblivion. They aren't so easy to transcribe. Small jumps and trills, like a small trout in a torrent." Soon after that discovery, with my first opportunity to perform in Denmark and spend time with the artist community there, I became even more fascinated with the links between the sound and aesthetics of the so-called Danish Spillemand, for Carl Nielsen's father was most celebrated of these on their native Fyn, and the radical solo works which Carl Nielsen, himself a lifelong violinist, would write between 1922 and 1925 for his son-in-law, Hungarian-born Emil Telmany. This came after the iconic 2 violin sonatas and the violin concerto. My study of these virtuoso late works has always gone hand in glove with an exploration of the enormous available source of Spillemand melodies and the aforementioned Norwegian Slotter. It was always clear to me that there were deep links between these 2 violin traditions, although on the outside they're quite dissimilar. Over a decade ago, I spent a summer in the States working on the 2 volumes of Danish Spillemand melodies known as the 358. There are actually over 700 of them in the collection, arranged by region. I made at-the-desk recordings of over 200 of them, alongside Nielsen's earliest work, which he reported in his Min Funske Barndom, My Foolish Childhood, a polka. This, whilst coming from the tradition, is not of the tradition. The piece really aroused the irritation, the ire of his acclaimed Spillemand father, Niels. I draw a direct line from the apparent failure of this little piece, written back in the 1860s, to Nielsen's late masterpieces for violin alone. And more recently, my work on this piece, these 2 sources, has been complemented by very, very bone-grinding, systematic, technical work on the violin volumes of the enormous Norske Folkemusik collections. Throwing into that pot, mixed into it, was my wife's research into the writer Hans Christian Andersen. Research happening in my home, which meant that all the sources, the materials were being brought in here, and many of these resources have never been available in anything apart from Danish. And one thing that floods from this is the cultural importance of the shared notions of Spillemand culture for Nordic literary and musical culture and art. Hans Christian Andersen wrote 2 poems named this, and his memoir, his autobiography, Kuhn et Spillemand, Only a Fiddler, specifically refers to this tradition. This, of course, was combined with his exchanges with the greatest Norwegian violinist, who he in fact wrote a fairy story about, an eventyr, Ole Bull. And it was Ole Bull who had first brought Hardanger virtuosos such as Torgeir Algodsen, known as Mullegutten, the miller's son, to international attention in the 1850s. Ole Bull single-handedly steered the approach to folk music away from the mere transcription of folk tunes and using of them within classical works to an actual understanding of the organology and the sound, technical setup, and the aesthetic of what the folk musicians were doing. Effectively, he moves it away from being a patriarchal, imperialist approach to it, almost a patronizing one, into a respectful one. It was Ole Bull and Andersen who laid the ground for much of Edvard Grieg's incorporation of the idea and actuality of traditional string playing into the actual fabric of his music. His string quartet, which is based on his setting of Andersen's poem Spillemand Spil på Strenge, fiddler play on the strings, is an example of this. Effectively, what happens here is the material which Ole Bull brought to Grieg's attention mixes in with Andersen's idea of the ideal of the Spillemand, and the result is Grieg's extraordinary and technically minutely precise string quartet. And of course, Grieg's encouragement would lead to Johan Halvorsen's extraordinary work, the Slotter, where I started, and those became the basis of Grieg's own transcription of these works, his Opus 72 piano sonatas, which put them in yet another frame. The publication of Halvorsen's Slotter in 1901 was the most public first airing of unbowdlerized realizations of the minutiae of traditional string players. It's worth pointing out, what do I mean by this? In the English-speaking countries, it's fair to say that we destroyed our folk tradition at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century by insisting that collecting should go hand in glove with improving and de-rudifying, effectively, most of the work, for instance, around the circle of Cecil Sharp House, the headquarters of the English Folk Dance Society, which is not far from the Academy, on the other side of Regent's Park. But most of what was achieved by collectors in the British Isles, particularly in England, well, the situation was much better in the north, was akin to putting lacy doilies around the work, bringing the rude rustics into nice drawings and making sure that their shoes were polished, and there was none of the actual stuff which made the music interesting. This is a tragedy. But Halvorsen's Slotter didn't do this. He presented the work with enormous detail and enormous fidelity, and it's fair enough to say that you could say they had an enormous and noticeable impact on the work of composers in Eastern Europe, who, whether or not they were working as transcribers in the 2 decades following, this has been largely overlooked, despite the fact that we know that Bela Bartok was enormously impressed by the work because he was referring to it in articles before the First World War. So it's pretty clear that he got hold of this Peters Verlag edition, which was beautiful and widely available. It was on his shelf before he started his collecting work with Kodai, which begins in the second half of the first decade of the 1900s. So just to put this into context, effectively what's happening here is that Halvorsen had given one of the models for which gave Bartok his impetus as what he might do, which gives him, following on from that, an ability compositionally to move away gradually from the post-Wagnerian model in which he was writing. If you like, what is it that enables him to strike away from the lyrical chromaticism and very particular romantic notion of lyricism, which you hear in the first violin concerto or the first string quartet, and find his way to the second string quartet, and particularly the 2 violin sonatas written in 1922 to 23 to Yeli Dareni. who, by the way, was also a pupil of Emil Telmanyi, Nielsen's son-in-law, who is very much a figure in this story. Because the arrival of the violinist Emil Telmanyi in Scandinavia and in Denmark, just before the outbreak of World War I, started to close the circle that I'm talking about. It's worth thinking of some of the other students of Diana Hubei himself, a pupil of Josef Joachim were. We have people obviously like Telmanyi, we have Zoltán Zeke, Jeli Darlani. These are absolutely seminal figures in the idea of what Hungarian Eastern European violin playing should be. But the arrival of Telmanyi, who had already collaborated extensively with Bartók, Schoenberg and Stravinsky, the arrival of Telmanyi in Denmark before the First World War, where he effectively got stuck because of the war, and then him becoming Danish, marrying Nielsen's son-in-law, means that there is an extraordinary almost chemical wedding between the ideas of the sounds of Eastern Europe and the way that Nordic countries were beginning to reevaluate creatively their cultural makeup. And common ground was found. And the common ground in both cases was between modernism and the music of the soil. So just as much as Stravinsky's Rite of Spring can be said to do that in one way, effectively imagining something emanating from the ground, similar things start to happen in the Nordic countries. And Telmanyi, who's coming in with all of this education and extraordinary violinism from Eastern Europe, is lights the blue touch paper in some ways for how this is articulated with Nielsen in Denmark. Now, it's worth bringing into play another idea here. This is, as you can see, is a big area, is to talk about what the cultural center of Europe might be. Now, classical music, as up till the 20th century, was very much predicated on the idea of an expanded Mediterranean culture, or at very least a kind of culture war between North and South Europe. A notion that on the one side you had this is fictional, of course, the classical columns of Greece and Rome, with arches added to it, the domes of the Italian Renaissance of Brunelleschi and the associated pastoral tradition, all of them devolved coming from Vitruvius, effectively, and the language and the ideas which flow from, say, Dante onwards, the humanism of the Italian Renaissance on the one side, and that being set in a creative counterpoint with ideas of the North. Although this again is a fiction, the association of a certain, and by North I mean northern Germany, I don't mean Scandinavia, where the architectural ideal will be, for instance, a Cologne cathedral, an idea that Gothic architecture was by definition Germanic, and then there was a link to the music and the literature. And there was therefore a kind of a creative friction between these two sides. And transient figures such as Beethoven, who travels from the Low Countries to Vienna, which in the terms of this debate is essentially a southern European country, that crossing of the border becomes a vital integer in the understanding of this fiction. But in the 20th century, a new idea of a kind of cultural orientation of Europe began to evolve. It's not one which has taken off in the consciousness of anybody who's not really from the Nordic countries. But it's also interesting that countries which are effectively Nordic countries have ended up denying that they are. So the idea is that instead of looking at countries as being orientated around the Mediterranean from west to east, from the Straits of Gibraltar through to the Levant, instead you imagine a cultural centre of gravity which stretches from the English Channel to the south, up United Kingdom along the east coast as its kind of, not border, but place around the centre of gravity, reaching north further through the Outer Hebrides and the Orkneys up to Iceland, all the way up to Spitsbergen in Svalbard, and then coming back down southeast to the whole Nordic region, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, then the Low Countries, and back to the English countryside. In fact, there were even maps published where you tilted this on one side and you saw this area as a kind of notional Mediterranean, with the very least an idea of shared culture. And a lot of this, of course, was to do with the idea of the lost North Sea English, the lost, by now completely lost, shared fishing communities and language, which stretched from the western coast of Northern Europe to the east coast of the British Isles, in which my family historically were very involved in. A time when fishermen working on the Dogger Bank, coming from Holland and coming from Norway and coming from Denmark and coming from Suffolk and coming from Scotland, were able to communicate in a shared language. There's an associated idea of culture from this, and of course at the heart of it, the base of it, is a memory at the very least of Viking culture as it stretched at one point all the way from the Americas all the way through Scandinavia to the Viking capital in Kiev in modern-day Ukraine. It's worth noting, actually, about Halvorsen, who's being the figure of this, in his early life as a violinist, was the concertmaster of the Aberdeen Orchestra in Scotland. And it's anybody who's ever taken the boat from Scotland to Norway will be actually quite shocked, not only as to how close they are, but how there's not a feeling that you're really doing more than crossing the English Channel. That link is historic, and it's part of the sharing of these ideas. A few years ago, I was enabled to build a project around the work of a Danish painter, mid-20th century Danish painter, Sven Halsten Mikkelsen, who actually grew up in the UK. I was able to build a project around this painter who was very involved in driving this idea. And it made me realise how this idea of this Nordic culture, which is not to do with Scandinavia, but to do with this broad expanse which covers music, myth, obviously, food, art, even geology to a degree, how much this idea underlies so much of the composers, musicians, artists and writers who fascinate me. And of course, my own identity as an East Londoner, whose family, as I said, worked historically in the North Sea fishing fleets, and where, of course, on the east coast of England, where we say ta for thank you, with anybody who spent any time in Norway or Sweden or Denmark will recognise where that comes from. This is the memory of the Vikings who ruled most of northeast and eastern England, and until some people would argue they never stopped, that the Norman conquest simply completed the job. After all, it wasn't a French conquest, it was a Norse conquest. And for me, marrying a Dane only increased the problem. Now, a vital driver of these kind of ideas in the modest living spaces of the North, and that is important, that cold countries and poor countries have small spaces, has been the idea of the salon, the impoverished salon, and the interchanges that it began to afford between art, science, music, philosophy, and political thought. So this stretched from the leaky-roofed soirees of what we can call Golden Age Copenhagen in the 2 or 3 decades after the British had reduced the Danish economy and the Copenhagen and the Danish Navy to rubble and matchwood, the economic crisis, which really stretched all the way through the 19th century in Denmark from 1807, certainly all exacerbated 50 years later, 60 years later by the German invasion, leading Denmark effectively to be so irrelevant as not even to be a factor in the First World War. This afforded considerable artistic freedom that, yes, they didn't have any money, but the scientists such as Jose Ørsted, the writers Andersen and Bjørnsen, the composers Niels Gade, Weiser, were all meeting in the same places, in salons run by people such as the Collin family, who couldn't afford a roof to be repaired, but they could make sure that artists met to discuss art and science and literature together. So these ideas begin to brew. And equally, as Norway and Sweden Norway gets its independence from Sweden in the middle of the 19th century, the music rooms outside Bergen, particularly Ole Bull's music rooms of Alastrand and Lusson, were all part of these kind of increasingly cosmopolitan Scandinavian get-togethers. And by the early 20th century, they started to fill with international player-composers, such as the Dutch-German Julius Röntgen, who would come to play. He, by the way, had been one of Brahms's favourite pianists, who played both of Brahms's piano concertos under Brahms in Vienna, and would come to play string quartets with Carl Nielsen at Fuglesang, one of the small country houses where Nielsen would spend a lot of time, later with Telmanyi. And, of course, what Röntgen brought into this was something which is quite even more unknown than the Nordic folk music, was an increasing awareness of Flemish folk music, both Fleming and Wallon, both Dutch-speaking and French. So these begin to build alongside Röntgen, bringing them to play chamber music with Grieg and Halvorsen in Bergen and Christiania, which would later become Oslo. In fact, Röntgen's long association with both Nielsen, Halvorsen and Grieg also enabled his introduction of these works based on traditional Dutch folk music to these Nordic cycles. And he wrote a cycle of suites and starters for violin in the years of his closest association with the Nielsen circle, and they're closely linked to works which began to emerge from Carl Nielsen for solo violin at the end of his life. And it's almost as if Röntgen finds his way into help liberate a new clarification of string sound in these circles. Now, of course, I identify with Röntgen because I'm an interloper in these circles. I'm not Nordic, although I have a Danish name which I stole. And so I'm interested in how people found their way, or if you like, in by default. So I'm particularly interested in the arrival in both circles of the young Australian but British-based and later American-based virtuoso pianist, composer and folklorist Percy Grainger, who appears in the Grieg Circle in 1906 for the first time, where he very much impresses Grieg with his playing of the piano concerto, and it's of course there where he meets people such as Röntgen. And alongside this, his long involvement in the Danish folk music collecting community, which I've referred to at the beginning, following his relationship with the Danish musician Karen Holten from 1908. Indeed, Grainger's groundbreaking solo viola work, the euphoniously named Room Music Titbits No. 7 Arrival Platform Hamlet, written between 1908 and 1912, which in many ways is the first example of a truly free creative work for solo violin or solo viola alone, as opposed to a sonata or a caprice or an improvisation. This was actually written on a freezing night in 1912, on the coldest winter of the 20th century, on Liverpool Street Station, not far from where I'm sitting, standing with the viola player Lionel Tertis, whose family, he grew up on Princelet Street. His father was the cantor of the Princelet Street Synagogue, which is literally a block from where they were standing, and they were standing there waiting for the boat which was going to bring his Danish lover, Karen Holden, to London. That, if you like, is just one these threads being pulled tighter, and I find that figures such as Röntgen and Grainger help me find my way into understanding these, and in some ways makes me understand Telmanyi's position better, because this is often the way that it's new arrivals in specific places, Telmanyi coming to Denmark and Norway, even you may go quite extreme, Beethoven, who of course has Dutch origins and a French-speaking mother, arriving in Vienna in 1792 and never leaving. It's the outsiders who are able to see clearly what a cultural milieu or redefinition needs. Part of this, for me, is a new approach to instrument technology at the time. Ole Bull had been I'm not going to talk about much today, but he had introduced a new notion that what were perceived limitations of Nordic folk instruments, such as the Hardanger violin, which in some ways is a memory of early instruments such as the viola d'amore with all of its sympathetic strings, and was regarded as being a curiosity, a throwback. But that starts to give players such as Olabol ideas of how they can experiment, for instance, with flat bridge technology to improve and enhance polyphonic writing. And that goes through into the fact that Tanmany, not long after arriving in Denmark, starts experimenting with the notorious Vega bow, which to enable polyphonic performance of the Bach sonatas and partitas, playing all 4 and 3 strings without broken chords, which the result is bizarre and wonderful, but also gave him lifelong tendinitis from the operating mechanism on the bow. But it's clear that that has more than an echo of the work on polyphonic violinism using flattened bridges, which was started about 60 years earlier in Norway. There's a direct link, as you can see there. So sometimes the grit in an oyster like this is a very modest demand. The first page of Nielsen's 1925 Prelude and Presto, which is one of the 2 big, late and comparatively unknown works in the UK anyway, by Nielsen for solo violin, which was dedicated to Tanmany, includes instructions as to how to purchase a patent mute from the luthier company of Hjorten Company in Copenhagen. It says, go to the company. It says it in 3 languages. Here it is. It says where to buy them. In 2003, I followed these instructions and was told that I was the first violinist to ever come in to inquire about Nielsen's specific instruction over 80 years earlier. And then they sold me the mute. Indeed, a few years later, when this ancient firm folded after over 200 years in business, they sent me a box of the patent mutes in thanks for my interest. Ironically, when the piece was published in the so-called Carl Nielsen Critical Edition, I was surprised to find that all reference to the patent mute had been stripped from the score and Nielsen's instructions and relegated to the critical commentary in another book, where, despite being depicted, it was dismissed as impractical. Now, I've been playing this work with a patent automatic mute for some years. So the reason I want to just bring this idea is that as opposed to what had been going on in the 19th century with virtuoso string playing, which you could argue was a kind of opening of the instrument, making the trajectory of the instrument greater, the tessitura wider, the coloristic range broader. What happens with the new impact of both folk music aesthetics coming from the north on both composition, performance, and instrument technology is effectively initially a focus on more simple things. For instance, playing adjacent to open strings, found harmonies. You can hear these in Bartók's third string quartet, for instance, where the harmony is simply what comes from the strings next to you. Use of scordatura. You could find it finding its way into one of Bartók's latest works for violin, his contrasts, or I would even argue that probably is one of the reasons it finds its way into Kodai's great work for solo cello, his sonata, which predates the First World War. These come from folk music traditions, and to a degree that is not a retrenchment, but it's going away from the ever bigger notion of playing to the ever smaller. And if you think about, say, Stravinsky's 3 pieces for string quartet for 1914, they are part of this process. And the relationship between the folk music revival of the late 1800s and these early 20th century adventures comes full circle after World War II. In his wonderful autobiography, Affa Musicus Beledbo, which has never been translated, Emil Tanmany reported that he was asked to give technical help to the great Norwegian hardanger player Sigbjørn Bjørnhoft Åsa to advise him how to deal with his fear of the microphone, because now, of course, the folk players were being asked not only to broadcast but to make LPs. And of course what was happening was that folk players, and it's worth looking at this, as opposed to their work being recorded as in a kind of ethnographic or situation, as you see imagine the famous photographs of Kodai and Bartók just playing and listening to villagers playing and sing. Now what was happening was that these players, as their music had become part of the national identity, and this obviously in the Eastern European countries was allied to a redefinition of national identity in post-revolutionary societies, where folk music very much became something which was not only identified with, but it was actually fostered, it was trained. So the problem then was, you can imagine a player like Otto was finding himself facing producers, radio and gramophone record producers, who were starting to lean into the technical demands, to ask for things to be technically better. And for the first time ever, folk musicians started experiencing the things which are usually had been the purview of classical players, that being stage fright, anxiety. So he asked Termani for help, and they became friends. In fact, the picture you'll see on the resource page shows the two of them on the fjord at Voss in western Norway, where for a photo op it was decided the two of them would get into a boat with Termani's wife and second wife, after he divorced Nielsen's daughter after Nielsen died, and their family. In fact, there was a string quartet, and you'll notice that Oscar is playing his violin, but if you look carefully, you'll see that Termani only has his violin in his lap. He was terrified that if he played it, he might drop it. I think I'm quite right with him here. But this is sort of brings it full circle. Here you have the great Hungarian Dane, who represents so much of the arrival of an impact between the Slav tradition finding its way and being flung headlong into the outcome of the 19th century, which comes from an impact. It comes from new understandings of folk music, finding himself to the other end of the story with the long living heir of Torgeir Augenson, the Muller's son, the Hardanger player that Ole Bull had discovered, and helping him. There's a kind of wonderful circle. I kind of love the idea that these lessons, apparently, according to Termani, took place at the stately home of Schäfergården, which is outside Copenhagen, north of Copenhagen, which is one of the places which has been key for and supported my exploration of these ideas over the years. It's one of the places I can go to explore these. Now, of course, any individual artistic response to a huge area like this is by very definition individual. It's inconsistent. My areas of inquiry and exploration are the definition of over-personal, and I admit they're incredibly subjective. And to a degree, having worked on this project since my late teens, it's interesting to me that I basically kept it private until now. And of course, one of the reasons is that it's been made very clear to me in both communities, but particularly in the Danish community for many years, that caution is necessary, because Nordic communities are not that sympathetic to what they call udlænding, outsiders coming in and taking any part in what they do. At various times it was pointed out to me, for instance in Denmark, that whilst this project was fascinating, and they would really like to do it, but they didn't think that an Englishman was the person to explore it. There were too many toes being trodden on. But now it seems time to put temerity to one side and make the work public, which is why I'm introducing it as a beginning of a conversation here today.